We're going to be going over endocrine histology, and we're going to look at 4 different endocrine glands. The first one we want to look at is the pituitary gland. And so first off, to understand how the pituitary gland works, let's zoom into the picture on the left, and let's realize that this top portion in blue up here is the hypothalamus, which is part of the brain. And the hypothalamus has clusters of cell bodies of neurons known as nuclei. And here in this picture, we've got 2 being pointed out to us, the paraventricular nucleus and the supraoptic nucleus. And the reason why this is being pointed out to us is because we can see that the cell bodies are clustered in the nuclei, but the axons of those cell bodies through these white lines here drop down, and they go through this pituitary stalk, and they drop down into the posterior pituitary gland, right? And so in this picture, the posterior pituitary gland is on the left of the picture, and the anterior pituitary gland is on the right. So what does this mean for us? Well, this means that the posterior pituitary has a nervous system histology because basically it is simply an extension of the brain, right? So going back to the idea that we have this hypothalamus up here in blue, right? And you can see that it's the border of it is this light blue. If you follow that color, that light blue extends down and creates that posterior pituitary. And the reason why this picture is showing us that is to show us that, in fact, the posterior pituitary is an extension of the brain. In fact, the hormones that are being made by the hypothalamus, those 2 hormones being oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, otherwise known as vasopressin, are being made up here in the hypothalamus, and then they're being shuttled through those axons downwards to then be secreted by the posterior pituitary gland. And then once they're secreted by the posterior pituitary gland, they make their way into the bloodstream, right? So there would be a blood vessel there to capture those hormones and send them off to go systemic, right? So you imagine a blood vessel here, right, that could then capture those hormones, the oxytocin and the vasopressin, and then those hormones would then go systemic. Now, regarding the anterior pituitary, the physiology of it is different in that you have hormones being made by the hypothalamus, and those hormones are called releasing hormones. And those releasing hormones go into the bloodstream up here, where you see that capillary bed, and then they travel down these capillaries that bring those releasing hormones, for example, thyroid releasing hormone or growth hormone releasing hormone, right? These are some examples. They bring them down to the anterior pituitary through these blood vessels, and then the anterior pituitary responds to those releasing hormones and makes hormones in and of itself. So, for example, if we're talking about thyroid releasing hormone, then the anterior pituitary would make thyroid stimulating hormone. If we're talking about growth hormone releasing hormone, the anterior pituitary would make human growth hormone. And so those would then be secreted in and of themselves into the bloodstream, which would then go systemic, right, to the rest of the body to then have effects, for example, at the thyroid gland itself eventually, or go to organs to stimulate growth throughout the body for human growth hormone. So that's the way that the physiology behind it works. And that gives you a sense also of the histology behind it, because if we look over here on the right as we zoom out, you've got the histology of the pituitary. And the only difference here is that in the histological slide, I've got the anterior pituitary on the left of the picture and the posterior on the right of the picture. So it's just flipped compared to what you saw in the drawing right here. But what this is telling us is that because the physiology is such that you have axons that are traveling down from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary, the posterior pituitary histologically is nervous tissue. It is an extension of the brain itself. Don't forget that the hypothalamus is a part of the brain. So this is just an extension of the brain itself. The anterior pituitary instead is glandular in its histology. And you can see here, for example, it's in green, right, in this drawing for a reason. And you can see that it is separated right here from that posterior pituitary, whereas the posterior pituitary is an extension of the brain. The anterior pituitary is embryologically different and is glandular. And so when we look over here at the histological slide, you can start to see that a little bit with the color difference of the anterior versus the posterior. The posterior is a bit lighter. And we can see that further in some pictures where we zoom in a little bit more down here. So let's go ahead and take a look at those. So if we look down here at this, at some other pictures of this, you can see that, for example, and these are some terms that you also want to be familiar with, is that the posterior pituitary is often also called the neurohypophysis. And notice that it says neuro, and of course neuro meaning nervous or nervous system. It is an extension of the brain. And the anterior pituitary is also known as the adenohypophysis. Right? So you've got these two side by side, and here in this picture you can really see how they are histologically different. Right? So you've got the neurohypophysis, which stains very light, and if you remember what the histology of the spinal cord looks like, it kind of reminds us a little bit about that nervous tissue that we've seen before. The adenohypophysis has much more of what we could describe as a glandular appearance. And when I say glandular, I also include other types of glands that we can think of. So, for example, some salivary glands or some pancreatic glands and such like that. So it has a bit of a different appearance, that glandular appearance versus the nervous appearance. And one more picture here that is very close up. So usually on a test, we won't have them this close. We'll kind of give you more of a faraway view, more like this one. But just in case, right, it's good to look at it close up to really see that difference of the staining of the neurohypophysis or the posterior pituitary compared to the adenohypophysis, otherwise known as the anterior pituitary. You can really see that staining there. So then, what are some questions that you want to be familiar with when it comes to this particular slide? So you might see a question such as this one. What is the name of the entire structure in the field of view, right? So if the question is asking you what is the name of this whole thing in the field of view that you've got here, for example, right? Then you would say the pituitary gland, right? And so here's your checklist, for example, right? You want to look at the checklist to see what you could answer. You could say pituitary gland. So then a more specific question, right, could very well be that we've got the pointer on one side of it, and it's asking you specifically what the pointer is pointing to, right? So, you're looking into the microscope, and you've got the pointer of the microscope, for example, pointing right onto, and I'll put an arrow here, even though microscopes don't have arrows, just to make it clear. It might be very specific with that arrow or with that pointer, asking you what is on that pointer, right? What is on the tip of that pointer, for example, right? So at that point, then you want to be more specific, and you want to say neurohypophysis, right? If the pointer is on the other side, right, then of course, right, in that case, you want to say adenohypophysis. So it's pretty simple once you get the fact that you've got these two very different stains pretty much right down the middle. One more thing to notice is that the neurohypophysis is usually smaller, right? It's usually smaller than the adenohypophysis. So that's another hint. But really focus on the stain to get these questions right. That's the best advice I can give for the pituitary gland. So let's go ahead and move on to our next endocrine gland. So the next two glands we're going to look at are the thyroid and the parathyroid glands. And the first thing we want to do is look at the gross anatomy of it to see where they are. So these are in your throat, and you can think about your hyoid bone, for example, as a landmark. The larynx, right? The hyoid bone and the larynx. And then under the larynx, you've got the thyroid gland. And so on the left side of this picture, you have the anterior view on the left side. And on the right side of the picture, you've got the posterior view, right? So this is your anterior view, and this is your posterior view. So what you want to notice is that from the anterior view, you basically see that thyroid gland, right? And from the posterior view, you see the thyroid gland, but you also see 4 of these lobes of parathyroid glands, right? So you got 4 parathyroid gland lobes in the posterior view. And this may be a little bit of a review for you. We had the skeletal system in A&P1. And in A&P1, we talked about blood calcium homeostasis. And we said that we have 2 hormones that regulate blood calcium for us. One is the parathyroid hormone, right, which is coming out of the parathyroid gland, right? And this was in order to basically increase blood calcium levels. And then you had another hormone that came out of the thyroid gland called calcitonin. And this was in order to deposit calcium into the bone to decrease blood calcium levels. And so we saw that there was a bit of a tug of war between these two hormones to basically keep us within homeostasis of our blood calcium. So we're going to see these again, but we're going to add a third hormone to our discussion today. And that hormone is not for blood calcium homeostasis, but rather for energy and metabolism. And that hormone is going to be called thyroid hormone. So these are the hormones to keep in mind. Thyroid hormone, right? So you got these three hormones that we can keep in mind as we look at the histology of this part of the body. So let's go ahead and start looking at that. So on the right here, you've got these two glands side by side on a histological slide. And what you want to notice is that very clearly here, you've got two different glands showing in this histological slide. You've got the parathyroid gland, which looks like that lobe, right? I mean, it's off to itself. There's obviously a capsule that's defining its border. So it's its own thing. And then surrounding it, you've got the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland has a very, very unique structure to it, where you've got these cuboidal cells that go in a circle, right? They go in a circle, and we're going to see a closer view of this. They go in a circle to make this circular encircling of what is a fluid on the inside that is known as the colloid. So within that, you've got this fluid that is known as the colloid within there. And that's being shown to you right here and defined and pointed out to you right there. So you've got basically that follicular epithelium, right, with those cuboidal cells encircling that colloid. So that's the first thing to keep in mind, right? If you can see that, if you can see that the parathyroid is on its own there, and that then you have the thyroid around it with with that follicular epithelium and the colloid, then that's your first step to being able to point out this histological slide and to get it right on a test. So let's go ahead and look at some other pictures of this and try to make sense out of it. So in this image, I've got a close-up view of that colloid, right? Surrounded by those follicular cells or that follicular epithelium. And so what you should notice is that these are, in fact, these cuboidal or square-shaped cells, right? And they're encircling that colloid, right? And they're going in a circle, and the colloid is there in the middle. One thing that this drawing here shows us also are the parafollicular cells, which are the cells that are basically outside of that follicular epithelium, right? They're kind of on their own, and they're in between right there. So you see one there, you see one right in here, and you see one over here as well. Those are the parafollicular cells. So let's try to figure out, because we mentioned that we have these hormones. We've got PTH, or parathyroid hormone, that we have to know where it's coming from. We've got calcitonin. We want to know where calcitonin is coming from. And we have thyroid hormone, and we want to know where thyroid hormone is coming from, right? Okay, so let's start with parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone, after all, it's called parathyroid, right? For a reason. Well, it's coming out of the parathyroid gland right there. So that's where it's coming out of, the parathyroid gland. That's where parathyroid hormone is coming from. So that's pretty easy to remember. Parathyroid hormone coming out of the parathyroid gland, right? Where is calcitonin coming from? Calcitonin is coming out of, and this can be a little confusing, is coming out of the parafollicular cells. And this can be a little confusing because of the word para, right? So some students do tend to get confused by this because they see that word para and they confuse this. Well, para just means next to. So we've got para being used here for parathyroid gland, right? So we've got that para right there, but that just means it is the gland next to, or para to, the thyroid gland. So in that case, we're using para for next to the thyroid, parathyroid. This para is being used for saying that we have these parafollicular cells. In other words, cells that are next to the follicle. So when we use this para right here, we're saying parafollicular. Or think about it this way. This is the follicle, right? That's the follicle. And this is next to, or para, the follicle, parafollicular, right? So again, calcitonin is coming out of the parafollicular cells from the thyroid gland itself. And finally, where is thyroid hormone coming from? Well, thyroid hormone is coming from the follicular cells themselves, right? So those cuboidal cells is where thyroid hormone is coming from. And they use, right? They use the colloid to make that thyroid hormone. And so let's look at the histological slide, right? Let's see if we can see some of this. First, let's go ahead and look at this zoomed in view because it's pointed out to us so we can really see this. So here we've got the colloid being depicted to us, right? We've got the colloid right here. We've got the follicular cells, those cuboidal cells are the follicular cells, right? Making that border. And of course, right, we can trace them on any of these follicles, right? There they are. And then what's cool about this zoomed in view is that you have a cluster, right, of parafollicular cells that are outside of that follicle right there. And so, right, let's go back to this one. Now we can see them here as well. And I know this is a little more blurred because the image is not as zoomed in, but here you can, for example, trace out those follicular cells, right, making that border of that follicle, right? And then next to, or para to, you've got a cluster of parafollicular cells. Okay, so let's go ahead and see then what some questions we want to be ready for are. So what is the name of the entire structure in the field of view, right? Well, right, if if they're showing us an image like this one, then you want to say thyroid gland, right? And some follow-up questions. What is the pointer on, right? Let's look at the checklist. It could be thyroid gland, it could be parathyroid gland, thyroid follicle, colloid, follicular cell, parafollicular cell. Okay, so let's do some practice with putting some pointers around, right? So here, for example, I could put the pointer on that parathyroid gland, right? And say, what is the pointer on, right? And you would want to say parathyroid gland. If I put the pointer on this right here, you would want to say colloid, right? If I put the pointer on, let's go to another picture, all right? If I put the pointer on right, that epithelium, you'd want to say follicular cell. If I put the pointer in between follicles, right? So if I kind of stuck it somewhere in here, right? There's no follicle there. Those would be parafollicular cells. And so you get the idea. You can see how we can phrase questions in order to make sure that you are familiar with this this histological slide. Let's go ahead and go to the next one, which is the adrenal gland. So let's go ahead and look at the adrenal gland. The first thing we want to see is that the overall shape of this gland has a kind of triangular or a boomerang type of shape to it. And we have two major parts of this gland. We have the adrenal medulla, which is this middle part. And the adrenal medulla is famous for making our adrenaline, right? Which is where the word adrenal or adrenaline, why we have those similar words for them, right? And that's going to be your fight or flight response that we learned about in ANP1. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And then for ANP2, our main focus of learning new material is on understanding how that cortex works. And the cortex is, of course, the part that is going to be on the outside and is encircling, right, the medulla. So all of that is the cortex on the outside. So let's look at what the cortex looks like. So if we were to take a slice of the cortex, right, in this box. So you take that slice of the cortex and you zoom into it, right, to see what it looks like. And this is the drawing of it, but it'll help us to understand the histology of it. You've got 3 layers of that cortex, right? So you've got the capsule on the top, right? So you want to imagine that you've got that capsule on the top of that cortex. And so that's right here, right? That's the capsule. And right underneath the capsule, you've got the first zone known as the zona glomerulosa. And the reason why it's called glomerulosa is because it has that circular right? That circular type of structure, that glomerular or circular type of structure of how the cells create those glomerular circular bundles right there. And this zone is famous for making mineralocorticoids. The word corticoid comes from the word cortex. In other words, it's coming out of the cortex, and it is affecting our minerals or our salts. And of course, the most famous one is going to be aldosterone, which works on sodium in order to regulate our blood pressure, right? So sodium is a mineral, right? Na plus is a mineral, and so therefore we can also call it a mineralocorticoid. The second zone is known as the zona fasciculata. Now the word fasciculata means that it's stringy, right? So on the right you also have this ball of yarn that is then that ball of yarn, that circular ball of yarn is supposed to kind of give you that glomerular idea or that circular idea, and then that string hanging down is that fasciculate idea or the stringy idea. So this part, right, has a very stringy type of appearance on the histological slides. And this one is famous for making glucocorticoids. Again, corticoid just means from the cortex. Gluco means it affects our sugar. And the most famous one for this one is, of course, cortisol. And again, notice corti from cortex. And cortisol does affect our sugar levels. The last zone is known as the zona reticularis. And this reticular kind of spider webby messiness that you see down here is where the word reticularis comes from. So it's kind of crisscrossing and messy. And that's what this part of the picture on the right is trying to give us, is that kind of messiness. That reticular messiness is where the word reticularis comes from. And this one is famous for making gonadocorticoids. Now, the word gonado means gonads or sex organs, right? And so this one is famous for making androgens, and testosterone is a type of an androgen. So things that are similar to testosterone. And these androgens can also get converted into estrogens eventually by the body. So it notice that whether it is something that looks like testosterone or something that looks like estrogen, right? Both of those hormones would go and affect gonads and sexual characteristics. And so not only do these three zones look very different from each other, but they are all they're looking different, but they're also making different materials for each other. Another interesting thing to notice about what these zones are making is that they're all going to be derivatives of cholesterol, right? So all three of these are fatty, lipid-soluble hormones, whether we're talking about aldosterone, right? Whether we're talking about cortisol, whether we're talking about androgens, right? In all three examples, these are fatty, lipid-soluble, cholesterol derivative hormones. And so here on the right, we've got that basic breakdown with two different stains here to kind of give us a different perspective on it. You've got the capsule on the top, you've got that zona glomerulosa, and maybe you can, it's a little blurry, but maybe you can see how it is kind of has that circular glomerular type of appearance. The fasciculata, you can really see that stringiness kind of coming down. The reticularis being a little messier. And then underneath that, right, you've got the adrenal medulla. And the way to know that you're in the adrenal medulla is that as soon as you see those big blood vessels right there, you know that you're in the adrenal medulla, right? The adrenal medulla having big blood vessels in the middle. Let's look at a overall view of this. This would be a very typical view that you would get from the slides in your lab. And this is a little more difficult to look at. So the first thing that I would do is I would first notice the two basic major parts of this adrenal gland. You've got this central part, the medulla. And how do I know that that is the medulla? Well, I've got those big blood vessels there and there and there and there and there, those kind of wide open spaces. That tells me that it is the medulla. And then you've got the cortex. And the cortex is the part that is surrounding, right? And it's curving this way. Now here it's chopped, right? But all of this, right, is going to be cortex, right? So it's chopped right there, but it kind of makes a circle all the way around that medulla, right? If you go back to that original drawing that we had, you can see that right in here, right? If that you want to imagine that maybe we're looking at this part right here, and so you've got the medulla in here, but then you've got the cortex making that circle all the way around it, and that's what's going on right here in this picture. Now, because of the fadedness of this image, it's really hard to see the details of the glomerulosa fasciculata and reticularis. And so, and this is often the case with slides that get faded over time, right? It's just part of it. And so what I would say is, if the pointer is, up here close to that capsule, then it's pointing to the glomerulosa. If it is kind of in the middle there, it's pointing to the fasciculata. If you see it pointing not where the medulla is, right, not where those big open blood vessels are, but pretty close to that border, it's on the reticularis. And that's just part of knowing the order of things and not getting too caught up with being able to see the extreme details of these, which are not always possible depending on the slide that we're using. Let's do the same type of idea for this. So the first thing to notice here is that we've got this border that is very, very clear. And here we can see that the medulla is this middle portion in here. Right, you can really see that. All of that is medulla. And the giveaway is that blood vessel there. And so that's the medulla. You've got the capsule that is making its way around, right, which is the border of the organ itself. And then you have to be able to differentiate between the zones. So the way I would do this is, again, if the image is not clear enough, right, to give you that glomerular, fasciculate, and reticular appearance, then imagine that the pointer is right here. Well, you can see that it's pretty close to the capsule. So if it's right there, then you would want to go with zona glomerulus. glomerulosa, right? If the pointer is right about there, well, it's pretty much smack in the middle, and the fasciculata is the longest of the three, right? So you want to go with the zona fasciculata, right? And if the pointer is right there, right, close to where that medulla is, but not quite, then you want to go with the zona reticularis. Right, so those are your three options, and that's how the pointer will be, right? You'll either have, and I'll go ahead and draw a line there. You'll either have a pointer doing this, or a pointer doing this, right, or a pointer doing that. And the other thing to notice is, of course, that this is going around in a circle, right? So all of this, as I'm tracing it, is all zona glomerulosa. Right? And you can see that it ends up being here where, right, all of that is zona glomerulosa. All of this, right, is all zona fasciculata, right, going into here, zona fasciculata, right, because it's making that circle around the medulla. And so you want to keep track of that. And finally, you've got the zona reticularis, right, that is doing this. Right here, it's called reticulata. We have it as reticularis in our lab manual, so just stick with that. But it's the same thing, right? The zona reticularis. And so that's the other thing to notice, is that the pointer could be anywhere throughout that circle that we just drew out, right? So you don't want to learn it just on one spot. You want to see how it encircles. Another common view that you get is this slice on the side here. And here I've got two images that have been kind of laid out on the side with a close-up view. The advantage to having these last two here is that you can see more of the details of the glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis. The disadvantage is that you don't see the adrenal gland entirely, and so it can be a little trickier if it's so zoomed in and you don't see the overall shape of the adrenal gland. Let's first look at what some of the common questions can be. What is the name of the entire structure, right? Well, then you would want to say adrenal gland, right? There's your checklist. We can put the pointer on the adrenal capsule. We can put the pointer on, we can ask you what the overall part there is. It would be the cortex or the medulla. And then more specifically, we could ask you for the zona glomerulosa, fasciculata, reticularis, and then finally that blood vessel, we could call it the medullary capillary. Okay. So let's go ahead and see where we can put the pointer here. So let's do some practice. If I stick the pointer right here, right? Well, that would be I'll let you think about it for a second. Yep, that's the capsule. Here, the same image is showing you the answer, right? That's the capsule. If I put the pointer right under the capsule, you can see how it stains pretty dark right under that capsule, so that's another giveaway. So if I put the pointer right there, you would say zona glomerulosa, right? If I stick it in the middle here, you would say zona fasciculata. You got it. And what about right here? So be careful here, right? Where is that? So I would say to, be aware of where the medulla begins and the cortex ends. So let's go ahead and trace that a little bit for ourselves, right? Here is the border. Can you see that? That is the border right there. Right? How do you know that? There's a bit of a staining difference of color, right, on this side versus that side. But then, of course, don't forget the giveaway, the major giveaway is always going to be that blood vessel right there, that capillary, right? Okay, so then let's go back to our practice quiz. So this is the zona reticularis. Very good. If I put the pointer in here, then I would be asking you for the adrenal medulla. And if I put the pointer right inside that blood vessel, that's when you could say the medullary capillary, right? And so that is how you go about understanding the adrenal gland. We're going to look at the pancreas as the last endocrine gland on our list. And the first thing we want to do is take a view of the drawing of the pancreas to really understand the essence of it and why it is such an important organ for us in two very different ways. And so the pancreas is very unique in that it is both an exocrine gland and an endocrine gland, right? So it has an exocrine function and an endocrine function. And that's going to help you understand the histology as well. So the exocrine function has to do with this long duct that you see moving through the organ and then eventually, right, releasing its contents into the duodenum of the small intestine, right? And you can see that it says right here that digestive enzymes are released into the duodenum. So what does that mean? Well, you want to imagine that food that has already been digested quite a bit by the stomach is now moving down this way into the small intestine and needs to be broken down further. And so the pancreas is supplying digestive enzymes to basically run into that food, okay, and start to break it down further for us. So that is the exocrine part of the pancreas. The second major function of the pancreas is the endocrine part of the pancreas, and that is being depicted by these clusters of in this diagram, these blue clusters throughout the pancreas. And those are known as the pancreatic islets or the islets of Langerhans. And what these are going to do is that they're going to make hormones for us. So that's the endocrine component of it, right? And the most famous hormone that is being made by those is known as insulin, right? Glucagon is the hormone that does the opposite of insulin. So insulin, right, when you've eaten a meal and uh, your blood sugar goes up, that insulin gets released by the pancreas, and in this case, notice where it's going, right? It's going into the bloodstream, right? That is the definition of a hormone, is that it goes into the bloodstream, and that chemical can have an effect far away from that site of secretion, right? So that insulin will now go to cells throughout the body and tell those cells to absorb the blood sugar so that it regulates blood sugar. It brings your blood sugar down by telling cells throughout the body to absorb that sugar. So these are your two major functions of the pancreas, and by understanding those two major functions, it'll also help you look at the histology differently. And so here what we've got is a zoomed in view of that little box, right, in the drawing of the pancreas. And what they're telling us is that if we zoomed in on that, we would see the exocrine acini, right? Acini is the plural, acinus is the singular. The exocrine acini, which are most of what you see here. So all of this is the exocrine part that is making those digestive enzymes that need to go to the duodenum to break down our food. And they are surrounding an islet, a pancreatic islet, or an islet of Langerhans, right? And that is right here. That is the pancreatic islet. And here they're telling us we have beta cells. Beta cells are the ones that make the insulin. Alpha cells are the ones that make the glucagon, which again is the opposite of insulin, right? If insulin brings our blood sugar levels down after we eat, glucagon does the opposite. If we're not eating and we're fasting or we're in starvation mode, glucagon will bring our blood sugar levels back up by taking the sugar from inside of our cells, the stored sugar, and releasing it into the bloodstream. Okay, so now let's see what a typical slide can look like. So when you see a slide like this, you might get confused with other glands. For example, salivary glands can look quite a bit like this. If the anterior pituitary maybe can look a little bit like this for some of us. It can be tricky. So what is the giveaway here? The giveaway here is that no other slide will have these pancreatic islets, otherwise known as islets of Langerhans, right? So these pancreatic islets that are staining light, that are surrounded by this other histological acini, right? All of this is acini, right? So acini is the majority of what you see. All of that is acini. All of this is acini, right? And then, right, you've got these islets of Langerhans. And the word islet comes from the word island, right? It's the same word, really. So you can think of it as islands, and acini comes from the word sea or water. So you can think of them as islands or islets, right, that are surrounded by water or acini. That's one way to view this to help you make sense of this and to help you not confuse it with other slides. Now, a close-in view, a very clear close-in view, right, makes this a little more obvious because right here you can really see that border of that islet of Langerhans that is extremely obvious, whereas right the acini have that characteristic darker staining glandular appearance, right? Here is what the acini look like. So there it is, right? That, see that circular kind of, that's the acini right there. Here's another acinus right there. Right? Those are, when we say acini, right, that's what we mean. And so here you can really see that. That there are these cells that are circling each other, making that acinus right there. But, right, just remember that the islet has that lighter appearance. Now, with all the coloring that I just did here, it's a little more difficult to see that difference, but if we remove all that, it should be easier to see again, right? So keep that in mind. And then sometimes the stain can really be much more drastic. And in this case, we can just consider ourselves more lucky, right? Every slide is different. Every staining is going to be a little different, so we can't always expect this type of staining. But here, right, with this very dark purple staining on the outside of the islet, right, that islet really, really stands out in this particular slide. So this is a great slide to really see that islet of Langerhans. So there, one more time, right, that's your endocrine part in the islet, right? That's what's making your insulin, that's what's making your glucagon, and that your exocrine digestive enzymes are being made by the acini that are encircling the islet. Okay, so again, let's look at the checklist. We've got our, of course, right, pancreas, pancreatic acini, or pancreatic islets. So it's a pretty short checklist, and it should be pretty easy to do as long as you can realize you're looking at the pancreas. Then the checklist is pretty easy. So if the question is, right, what is the structure in the field of view? Well, you would have to want to go with pancreas, right? If there is a pointer, right, then the pointer could either be pointing onto the acini, and so then you would want to say acini or pancreatic acini, or it could point into the islet. And at that point, you could either say pancreatic islet or islet of Langerhans. That's up to you. I like saying the islet of Langerhans. It just sounds a little better to me. But either way is fine. So that is your histology for the endocrine system. Just to recap, we looked at the pancreas, we looked at the adrenal gland, we looked at the thyroid and parathyroid glands, and the first one that we did was the pituitary gland for this exercise.